Right, put your parliamentary role to one side here, Jim Molan. You're someone who's led troops in battle. You've worn the uniform. Now, when this report is released next week, what sort of impact will it have on military personnel and their families? The PM says it'll have allegations that will be tough for Australians to hear, but it's got to be toughest on those inside the ADF and our veterans, doesn't it?
I think it will be tough, Peter. Of course, as the Prime Minister said, none of us have seen the detail of the report, and when it's released, it will be heavily redacted, I would expect. But we're a very proud organisation. We're a national institution. We wear the slouch hat, and the slouch hat is a national symbol, and that's very, very important because we need, going into the strategic environment that's coming up, we need the Australian Defence Force to be tremendously effective. It's only ever as effective as its individual members and the population that sits behind it. So I think that's what we've got to keep in mind. And the process that the Prime Minister announced and the Defence Minister announced today is absolutely key to maintaining the faith and the trust that the Australian people have in the Australian Defence Force. And I think that's where the rubber hits the road. We announced it this week, as the Prime Minister said, so that when the report comes out, the process, the trusted, accountable process, wouldn't be lost in the hubbub around the report itself.
And look, that's a smart way to do it. I mean, we'll get to the detail of the framework that's going to sit around the Brereton inquiry's report released, and it will be, as you say, heavily redacted. But what's alleged here, obviously, is war crimes, or better expressed, activity in the field of battle that's outside the laws that govern war. Now, a lot of people might be surprised at how many rules exist in law about what's lawful use of force, what's a lawful killing. I worked for a Defence Minister, and I think I probably, even as a lawyer, underestimated the laws around how you participate in a warlike environment. You've led coalition forces in the Middle East. You were in Iraq. Take us through how all of the legal ramifications of what you do in a field of battle come into play when you lead an army.
Well, first, Peter, you rely on the individual soldier's moral framework. And what comforted me in Iraq, because when I was there, although as an Australian I played no part in how the Americans managed the very few individual failures of the laws of armed conflict, I was there at the time of the Abu Ghraib scandal. When the Abu Ghraib scandal, I had just arrived when it hit the headlines through congressional inquiries in the United States. So the first thing you do rely on is the moral framework of an individual. Lots of individuals have different moral frameworks, and I think a moral framework we may have enjoyed 50 years ago you don't see with modern people, so you need rules. And those rules are first exposed to soldiers and to officers, commanders, leaders during the training process. And it's mandated that every training process has a period of time where you enforce on people the laws of armed conflict so they know what's expected of them. When you're out in a combat situation, you're governed by what they call the rules of engagement, which is where a government tells its soldiers when you can use lethal force. And of course, you can always use lethal force to protect yourself. You can use lethal force to protect people who are with you, and under different rules you can aggressively go against organisations that you can identify, people in organisations you can identify, and use lethal force against them. What comforted me in the 3 individual occasions that I remember out of American forces in Iraq was that on each occasion where someone had committed an unlawful act, operated against the laws of armed conflict, their mates told the chain of command. And Peter, that's very important, because if you look at there was 150,000 Americans, 20,000 other nations, and then there was the Iraqis. And if you have these things happen, as you said, as the Defence Minister said when she was talking, when you have these things happen, you can't tar the entire organisation with the same brush. And that's critically important. The moral frame of reference that each person carries into battle is very, very important. And then on top of all that, you supervise and you ensure that people are accountable for what they're doing. And this is the ultimate manifestation, Peter, of Australia holding its forces to a higher standard than the enemy, holding its forces to a higher standard than most countries in the world. And I just have to reassure people who think that sounds strangely, you can still win. And if you don't obey the laws of armed conflict, in all probability, you're going to lose.
So out of the announcement today, there will be an Office of a Special Investigator and it will be set up inside the Home Affairs Department. So this will take forward prosecutions out of the Brereton inquiry if that's the work of the investigator, if that's where they land. Now, I think it's important that that's not inside Defence for obvious reasons. Then there'll also be a body, an oversight committee it's called, that will deal with culture change, and that will report directly to the Minister, Linda Reynolds. Let's stay with the Office of the Special Investigator. Are we confident? We're talking about the investigation of 55 or so separate incidents over the past 4 years. Some 300 witnesses, we're told, were involved in the process. If our soldiers are accused, will they get support to ensure a fair trial, legal support? And how much will be made publicly before there's a decision of guilt or innocence? Because that also has huge ramifications for their good name if it's found at the end they didn't do what was alleged.
No, that's correct, and I have every confidence that the Office of the Special Prosecutor, which is funded and personnel with special skills are provided out of the Australian Federal Police. It will be part of the Australian Federal Police, and it will be headed by a special investigator, a special person. It will be able to use all the laws that protect our rights as individuals in this Australia, which is run by the rule of law. And that's why it will probably take a fair while. Now, I can't comment on how long it will take, but I've heard comments today that it will take a long time. I can imagine it will. I've watched American prosecutions, many of which were not successful, out of the Iraq War, and they took literally years to do. And the beauty of that, Peter, is that if we're going to prosecute people who are alleged to have broken the laws of armed conflict, then the rule of law must apply to that. And
the rules of evidence too.
Faith. Absolutely,
and of course, we're talking about battleground Afghanistan, in some cases 5, 6, 7, 10 years ago. So you'd want all the evidentiary material provided before soldiers are dishonourably discharged, I presume, and face then other penalties in other courts.